Welcome back, everyone. It's me, Professor Pretentious, here with 40 reviews, and today we're reviewing 28 Years Later. I know this one's a little late, but I couldn't get to earlier 28 Year Later shows. I was working on the 40 Acres review, which was a film that was a little bit more gripping to me personally, and I got a little bit more excited about. So, in the spirit of doing things that you love, I'm going to continue to do reviews of movies that I'm interested in. Man, time just keeps passing. If you told me that in 2008 that Danny Boyle, the director of Slumdog Millionaire, Trainspotting, and 28 Days Later would be overshadowed by the writer of two of his films, I'd have been, well, I'm just surprised. I'm sorry, y'all. A little tired here. As you can see, my 5-year-old has decorated our entire room with stuffies today. It is the Stuffy Zoo, and we're leveling up. He's just helping me level up here. So you see, we have one of those fancy dancy microphones. Very nice. I have the pro equipment right now. I have clipped on my phone to my computer, and I have my computer set up on a Lego box. Top of the line pro equipment. So here we are, 28 years later. In these years, I've been far more impressed with Alex Garland. He just has an incredible sense of story. He was a novelist before becoming a screenwriter. However, his largest body of work is in screenwriting. Alex Garland's mastery of the sci-fi adaptation with Annihilation, Dread, or Never Let Me Go, or reinventions of his own with 28 Days Later, Ex Machina, and Civil War, has rightfully placed him in the pantheon of genre film writers slash directors. He makes compelling character-driven narratives that balance richness of concept and idea with pacing and suspense. Even his weaker screenplays, in my opinion, Civil War and Never Let Me Go, are still compelling from beginning to end with some memorable sequences. I think of the Hailsham scenes in Never Let Me Go, and of course the What Kind of American scene in Civil War. At their worst, they're still memorable movies, in my opinion. And what I can say about this movie, though, is that it follows very familiar beats, and barring a remarkable, surprising screenplay for the second film, I can anticipate a very conventional second one with a largely predictable resolution. This film has some crazy first time director energy for a director that started his first film in, I think, 1994 with Shallow Grave. And you wouldn't know that this is someone who's been in the genre for 30 years, but here's Danny Boyle. He really brings that first time director energy to this film. And in my opinion, it's not necessarily in the benefit of it. There's a more fragmented quality to the film on a shot by shot basis, but not in a way that I feel serves the film. It's even more disconnected in some ways than 28 Days Later. So Danny Boyle's always been a master of style, and he does bring that to each one of his movies. While Alex Garland, has proven as a director to be a master of clarity. So it feels as if Garland's script and his intended tone is at odds with Boyle's idiosyncratic choices, to say it mildly. Despite his freshness and mastery of form in with Danny Boyle, I'd honestly prefer this film to have been directed by Alex Garland because he's really proven himself in at least the past 10 years in his ability to actually stylishly and cohesively direct a film as well as write it. Tonally speaking, this is a unique zombie film. We know it, it's hard to make this fresh again. This is hands down the most played out horror genre of the 21st century. It's been reinvented half a dozen times since the first 28 film. In my mind, the last great English language zombie film was Zombieland in 2009. And this is also appropriately the year of Romero's last Dead film. A year later would be the beginning of the end. Zombies had gone prime time with Plants vs. Zombies, which had grasped the youth market, and the Walking Dead series lumbered toward a self-fulfilling prophecy about the lengths an IP will go to remain standing. So it's hard to make flesh fresh again. But they do try here by most notably slowing down the pace. I'm also saying this completely aware that this is simply part one in a two-part film. The film isn't as frantic or propulsive as the other two films. It mimics the distance and the pace of the title 28 years later, that there's far more time to breathe and contemplate the state and implications of this world that we're living in. There's far less suspense in the film as a result. It does have some captivating set pieces and sequences. Without spoiling too much, look towards the cottage, the causeway in the film, and the opening scene. These ones do harken back to the original 28 Days Later in some ways, and in other ways, they create something newer and more deeply cinematic than, say, the first film. As far as themes, we see a loss of history as a big part of this movie. Time becomes highly relative, and they play to the idea of a surrounding world frozen in time, as do many zombie movies, but this one does stretch out the timeline a little bit longer. So it does play to the idea of the surrounding world frozen in time, as well as a world that's also reverted to a more civilized yet effectively medieval enclave where the main characters live. There's no 21st century technology, and it's mentioned that very few people even have photographs. So Boyle emphasizes this idea of history being lost with the intercutting of film strips from British history, from World War One, World War Two, and again, it does strike me as being this style that is at odds with Garland's screenplay in particular. So again, this won't be that much of a spoiler. It's very near the beginning of the movie. Spike's mother, Isla, has a mysterious condition that causes dementia symptoms, the disorientation of which Jodie Comer plays with a remarkable subtlety. And as somebody who's experienced these firsthand from family member, I do appreciate this nuanced presentation of the symptoms as coming from within the character rather than how we as observers might see it. We as the audience are intended to feel in isolation, and it's a feature that drives the horror of each of these three films, from that opening sequence of 28 Days Later, as Cillian Murphy ambles through a completely isolated, shut down London. So as a result, we don't learn much about outside intervention from other countries. We see more of this addressed in 28 Weeks Later, and we know that England and Scotland are the affected zones, and we do see very mild intervention from one country in 28 years. But it's still uncertain as to why the world hasn't done more to help the UK. If the virus is so infectious, then how do survivors in its own country manage to remain safe? Has nobody developed a vaccine or a treatment for the rage virus? I don't know if the idea of immunity from the second film is canon, but it seems not in here. So for me, it's notable that there's not more addressing of this. I can't tell if it's supposed to fit in metaphorically with it, but I feel like even in a film that's supposed to fit in metaphorically, there needs to be a real world engagement with that concept. After reflecting on this film a couple of days later, that is something that still sort of sticks with me. I'd say the strength of this movie, and a lot of people found this to be more of a detractor, but the strength of the movie is it's a more mournful and reflective type of film. While I am disappointed about the pacing and suspense that I've come to expect from the 28 films, I'm fully on board with their intention with this movie. The zombie film is at least 15 years overdue for another reinvention, and this one makes it more of a psychological film than it had been in previous years, but for a very different reason. I feel like Jim Jarmusch was trying to do this with Dead Don't Die, in which it happens in a very small rural area. But it's almost rustic and pastoral in the sense that this has gone back to nature in this long amount of time. So the rural setting, to me, feels like almost a horror version of the Planet of the Apes films. It feels a lot to me like the movie I saw almost exactly a year ago, which was Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. But zombie films, since Romero or even Val Lewton's I Walk with a Zombie, have always been about reflecting the nature of living death and the power lost in one's own actions as a result of being in this state. Romero's influence of and on the 1970s American New Wave places him neatly in the realm of the social problem film, common in that era. Night of the Living Dead is obviously the problem of war, protest, and its subsequent media coverage. Dawn of the Dead focuses on the systems of socioeconomic inequality and the dwindling middle class. And then Day of the Dead is the battle between the authoritarian neoconservatism of the 1980s and the science-based liberalism in attempting to address our common problems. Regardless, each film really focuses on the problem. So comparisons for 28 years later will be drawn to Day of the Dead, invariably, as we grapple with the evolution of the infected survivors, an established community, and a more somber tone. Not to mention, it's the third installment of an intended trilogy. So as the zombie movie's always been quite astute at pointing out the problem in our society, and the problem inherently with human nature, 28 years later seems to be seeking out the solution to the problems of 21st century modernity, which George Romero presaged would continue to dominate us. This is, to me, the strength of the film. Hopeful is never a feature of Romero's Dead films, and is itself somewhat of a rarity even within the genre. This film sets itself apart as, I'll dare say, a surprisingly optimistic story. The reason I say optimistic is because this film acknowledges death as an inevitability, so this film focuses on choice of death. And when we actually sit down to it, the film hints at this concept that choice of death is really an existential rarity, especially in these films where even your death results in a transformation rather than an actual annihilation of your body and a release of your soul. And so a big focus on this film becomes the quest to die with dignity on one's own terms as an ideal. Let's spoil some stuff. Whereas the Dead series is about entropy, and a lot of the films that follow it are about this, the 28 series has begun to set a new tone of rebirth. The rage zombies evolve into a hierarchical social status, with the intellectually and physically superior creatures taking on a leadership role. We also see them taking on a role of provider and parent. Now, one of the more disturbing sequences in this film is the birth of what, at least at the end of the film, still appears to be an uninfected child from an infected woman. It's a very delicate situation, and it adds a lot more intensity and stakes to the journey throughout the rest of the film. One of the things that the movie hints, and I could be wrong, is that one of these main alpha zombies actually seems to be the father of this child. Whether that will be confirmed or even followed in the next film, I can't say. But it was something that was interesting. I couldn't see how it completely fit in, but it was emotionally engaging. The film, to me, really starts to reach its peak in the section where we're introduced to Ralph Fiennes as Dr. Kelson, because he provides the heart and the mystery of this film. Once we actually see him and what he's been doing in essentially cremating these bodies, is that he actually treats all life with dignity and respect. One of the common features of zombie films is the inhumanity of man in interacting with these creatures. And Ralph Fiennes treats them with caution, yes, but also with dignity and respect. Uninfected, infected alike, because he sees them all as victims. He has an equal appreciation for both rage victims and the uninfected, which marks a level of compassion that's less evident in most of these zombie films. Undeniably, it's the climax of the film, and the climax is the heart of this one. It really sets this tone for the film, both reflective and mournful, as well as hopeful. The climax here isn't necessarily even a suspenseful one. The climax is the death of Isla, Spike's mother. It solidifies this film as a more dramatic, character-driven affair than the other two in the series. The action of Spike being brought back his mother's delicately cleaned skull after she has been essentially mercy killed by Dr. Kelson is a poignant and beautiful sequence. It's undeniably the standout of this film, at least for me. If you even look to the marketing of the film, you can see this shift in tone. Compare that to this other cardboard stand-up that I saw at the movie theater. This stand-up reveals the new marketing for this film and the intention that they're going with in showing people that this is more of a character study. This is more of a pensive film. The trailer even mimics this expectation of the characters. The characters in the beginning don't know much about Kelson, and they see him as almost something of a ghoul. And so we see this skull tower in the trailer, and at least for me, it seemed horrific and menacing until the purpose of the skull tower is revealed in the climax of the film, at which point these towers become reverent and empathetic relative to the casual death that we see in these 28 films. And him placing his mother's skull at the very top of it is a very beautiful, heart-wrenching moment that I feel begins to encapsulate what this movie is really about rebuilding. So in general, with two-part films, which have become more and more common, we're far more accepting of unresolved endings in non-standalone films. I remember my friend renouncing any of the two Lord of the Rings sequels after watching how Fellowship ended, which in retrospect isn't even that abrupt. But this film does seem to hit a little too abruptly. When you'll see it, you'll understand why it ends where it does, but also recognize the film could have ended more successfully a little bit earlier. From a narrative standpoint, all sequential films should be self-contained. I will die on this hill. In some way, they should be self-contained. And this film goes about 5 to 7 minutes too far. And I think what happens is that it seems like it's in an attempt to wrap around the beginning sequence of the film that charts this Jimmy character from the opening scene. It falls prey to the same problem that a lot of continuing series do, the attempt to set up the next film. With this attempt to wrap around, it ends up just feeling tacked on because we don't follow this character throughout the entire film. There's no real reveal, there's no real engagement in his involvement here. So 28 years later for me is definitely worth seeing. It's not particularly groundbreaking. I prefer it to 28 Weeks Later. 28 Weeks Later was successful in its attempt. It was well acted. It was generally well written. But this movie is a little bit more resonant with me. I feel like 28 Weeks Later is a little bit more forgettable overall. And that can be the worst crime of a film, which is to be serviceable, to be acceptable, rather than memorable in some way. And this film's lows aren't particularly low, but their highs are pretty high. So I am excited to see the next one. I'm also excited to see whether Alex Garland can begin to build back up to a more concise narrative. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.